Introduction. In many of my videos, I receive comments which point towards the failures of authoritarian socialism and attempt to use these as an argument against libertarian socialism by conflating the two. In this video, I'd like to clear up this misconception. Firstly, I'd like to begin by defining my terms and explaining the divide between authoritarian socialism and libertarian socialism while highlighting its practical significance. Secondly, I'd like to apply an anarchist method of analysis to revolutionary socialism and make the case for why libertarian socialism is preferable in achieving socialist ends with reference to class analysis and historical evidence. Before I make these arguments, I'd like to define what I mean by the terms socialism and the state in order to promote a shared understanding and avoid debates over semantics. Defining socialism. In a broad sense, socialism is an ideology which seeks the emancipation of labour from capital. In a narrower sense, socialism is an economic system in which the means of production are owned and controlled collectively by the workers rather than privately by bosses. It's important to stress here that socialism is not merely being used to refer to government programmes or health and safety regulations for employment. Sorry, liberals. Socialism is being used here to refer to an alternative economic system to capitalism and the means to achieve said economic system. The positions I'd like to discuss in this video are factions within revolutionary socialism. That is to say, forms of socialism which believe that reformist methods are not sufficient in and of themselves and that a revolution must take place in order to establish socialism. Although there are forms of socialism which do not subscribe to this viewpoint, I will be assuming that this is indeed the case and that capitalism cannot be reformed out of existence. Defining the state. In this video, the word state will be used to refer to a combination of three individually necessary and jointly sufficient components. Firstly, a centralised institution with a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. Secondly, a clearly defined geographical area over which this violence is exercised. And thirdly, a centralised administrative governing body which lays claim to use of this violence. The question of the state plays a central role in the debate between authoritarian socialists and libertarian socialists. I shall now explain the distinction between libertarian socialism and authoritarian socialism. Libertarian socialism. Libertarian socialism is a system in which the workers own and control the means of production. That is to say, it's socialism as defined before, but also libertarian socialists seek to abolish the state and replace it with decentralised free associations with an overall view towards creating a non-hierarchical society. As well as advocating a non-hierarchical and stateless society in which the workers own and control the means of production, libertarian socialists reject taking state power as a means to achieving this end. That is to say, libertarian socialists reject the idea of creating one or more libertarian socialist parties and placing them in control of the administrative component of the state apparatus. Instead, libertarian socialists seek to create non-hierarchical institutions which serve to build the new society in the shell of the old. Tendencies of political thought that could be described as libertarian socialist include most varieties of socialist anarchism, such as collectivist anarchism, anarcho-communism, mutualism, individualist anarchism, and left-wing market anarchism. Other tendencies include communalism, participism, and inclusive democracy. Certain strains of Marxism can also be described as libertarian socialist, such as libertarian Marxism, autonomism, situationism, and council communism. Authoritarian socialism. Authoritarian socialism here refers to a form of revolutionary socialism which shares the same ends as libertarian socialism of creating a state and class-free society based on worker control of the means of production. However, authoritarian socialists do not share the same means to achieving this end, and this is where the disagreement lies. Authoritarian socialists advocate taking state power in some way or another as a means to achieving their ends. This is because they believe that this strategy can be used to achieve their ends and is necessary to achieve their ends. Tendencies that could be categorised as forms of authoritarian socialism mainly include certain forms of Marxism, such as Marxism-Leninism, Trotskyism, Stalinism, and Maoism. This is not to say that Marxism is necessarily authoritarian, but merely that tendencies which advocate taking state power as a means of revolutionary change are. This divide between authoritarian socialists and libertarian socialists is practically significant, because the two positions advocate radically different means of initiating revolutionary social change, and as such, they are very likely to have different consequences. Thus, individuals who oppose revolutionary socialism should take care to demonstrate an awareness of this distinction and consider before making a criticism of whether or not it is applicable to both factions. Revolutionary socialism. a libertarian socialist analysis. Libertarian socialists believe that social hierarchy, that is to say, a form of organisation in which individuals are ranked one above another in degrees of status and authority, does not justify itself. Unless those in a position of hierarchical authority can provide a justification for their position, then it should be dismantled, particularly by those over whom it is exercised. The social relation should then be reorganised from below in a more egalitarian fashion. In this video, I'd like to apply this method of analysis to revolutionary socialism and assume that the burden of proof lies upon those who wish to use hierarchical forms of organisation in pursuit of socialist ends. I will split my analysis up into 3 stages: identification, justification, and conclusion. Identification. Authoritarian socialists wish to take state power, which is a hierarchical form of organisation. This can be understood through class analysis and examination of the state as an institution in itself. If we're to define the state in the sense mentioned before, individuals and groups within the administrative component of the state apparatus are vested with a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, consequently ranking them with greater status and authority than those outside of the state apparatus. Furthermore, these individuals are specialised to carry out a specific form of labour, that is to say, empowering administrative labour. This combination of specialisation and exclusion requires a division of labour across society between those who carry out administrative labour and those who do not, resulting in a form of hierarchy in which those who monopolise empowering and appealing administrative labour consequently possess far greater status and authority than those who carry out the menial tasks. I will hereafter refer to this specialised class as the coordinator class, which lies between the capitalist class and the working class. To reiterate, the state is composed of 3 individually necessary and jointly sufficient components: a centralised institution with a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, an administrative governing body which lays claim to use of this violence, and a geographical area over which this violence is exercised. If this is indeed what we mean by state, and if it is indeed the case that the state requires the perpetuation of a coordinator class which possesses far greater status and authority over the working class on the grounds of its monopolisation of empowering labour, then how can we describe the authoritarian socialist position? Well, what follows from this is that the authoritarian socialist position, by advocating for one or more socialist or communist parties to take state power, supports the creation of a coordinator class which holds a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. As such, it technically follows from this that acts of coercive expropriation of the capitalist class by working class non-state actors are illegitimate, without state approval, if it is the case that state actors hold a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. It's clear then that the authoritarian socialist position advocates some form of hierarchy as a means to achieving a state and class-free society based on workers' control over the means of production. Justification. Having identified a form of hierarchy in the authoritarian socialist position, I'll now examine whether or not this form of hierarchy advocated by authoritarian socialists can successfully meet its burden of proof. It appears that authoritarian socialists believe that this form of hierarchy is justified because they hold a certain set of premises to be true about its strength as a means to achieving their ends. In particular, they believe that it can be used to achieve their ends and is necessary to achieve their ends. I'll address each of these premises individually. Number 1. The efficacy of state power. Firstly, is it the case that taking state power can be used as a means to achieve workers' control over the means of production? Well, if it is the case that coercive expropriation of the capitalist class is monopolised in the hands of the coordinator class, then we can also expect the coordinator class to monopolise control over the means of production which have been expropriated from the capitalist class, thus constituting a new ruling class in itself. This creates a form of state capitalism, in which all of the previous functions of the capitalist class are instead undertaken by the state. Rather than the workers having direct control over production, they become hired employees of the government. This process can be seen occurring in numerous revolutions, and by numerous I mean just about all of them, that have adopted authoritarian socialist methods. In October 1917, in a draft decree on workers' control, the leader of the Russian Revolution, Vladimir Lenin, stated that delegates elected to exercise worker control were to be answerable to the state for the maintenance of the strictest order and discipline and for the protection of property. Nice worker control, eh? Lenin noted later in December 1917 that the Supreme Council of National Economy that had been created was to replace, absorb and supersede the machinery of workers' control. In 1918, Lenin wrote in the immediate tasks of the Soviet government that unquestioning subordination to a single will is absolutely necessary for the success of processes organised on the pattern of large-scale machine industry. Today the revolution demands, in the interests of socialism, that the people unquestioningly obey the single will of the leaders of labour. The hostility of authoritarian socialism towards worker control in the USSR can be further demonstrated by the behaviour of the Soviet government in response to the Petropavlovsk Resolution of February 1921. Sailors in Kronstadt made a series of 15 demands, and number 14 called for the institution of mobile workers' control groups. This resolution led to a rebellion, and the Bolshevik government responded on March the 7th by attacking Kronstadt with some 60,000 troops. Official Soviet figures estimate that about 1,000 rebels were killed. In April 1921, Lenin admitted the intentional implementation of state capitalism in Russia as the new economic policy, in which nationalization was slightly scaled back and some individuals outside of the state were allowed to own small enterprises. In November 1922, Lenin admitted that the new economic policy has changed nothing radically in the social system of Soviet Russia. Morris Brinton's pamphlet, The Bolsheviks and Workers' Control, the State and Counter-Revolution, gives a detailed historical timeline of how the Bolshevik government consistently and systematically undermined and destroyed the workers' councils and the factory committees. This quote from Lenin sums it up. If the trade unions, 9/10 of whose members are non-party workers, appoint the managers of industry, what is the use of the party? The hostility of authoritarian socialism towards worker control over production can also be observed in other situations. For example, Fidel Castro's Marxist government following the Cuban Revolution engaged in active suppression of worker control. In an eyewitness report, anarcho-syndicalist and labour union activist Augustin Zucchi described how the National Institute for Agrarian Reform had destroyed the worker-controlled shoe manufacturing collective that had been established in Manzanillo. He said, "This popular initiative of the Manzanillo shoe workers was soon squelched. The Manzanillo section of the Communist Party was against free cooperatives which clashed with their authoritarian ideas. They therefore urged Russian-style absorption of the voluntarily collectivized workshops by the INRA. This proposal was enthusiastically endorsed by the INRA bureaucrats and the cooperative shoe industry was taken over." Zucchi felt that the system that had been created in the rural collectives in Cuba was far too reminiscent of the hierarchical Soviet model, and he argued this in his eyewitness report, stating that Cuba is the only Latin American country in which agrarian cooperatives are managed by military personnel. The report was published as a pamphlet called Testimonies of Cuban Revolution, and 3 days after Zucchi left, the Cuban government seized and destroyed as many copies of the pamphlet as possible. Historical evidence suggests that authoritarian socialist methods in Cuba and Russia have not only failed to produce a state and class-free society based on worker control over the means of production, but have also engaged in the active suppression of worker control over production as opposed to state capitalist nationalization. For further evidence that authoritarian socialist means do not achieve the desired ends of a state and class-free society, we can look at the history of Marxist-Leninist governments, not only as institutions which subordinate the working class to the coordinator class during their rule, but also as institutions which have historically recapitulated to corporate capitalism. Authoritarian socialists also defend taking state power on the grounds that doing so is necessary for a transition from capitalism to socialism, just as it was necessary for a transition from feudalism to capitalism. The problem with this argument is that the transition from feudalism to capitalism was merely a transition from one form of class society to another. On the other hand, the same cannot be said of socialism, which aims at the abolition of class society altogether. The problem with this argument is that it underestimates the extent to which the state is bound up with class society. The fundamental error behind the authoritarian socialist position is that it does not see the state as being an institution which is intrinsically oppressive towards the working class, but instead it merely sees it as being oppressive within the context of a capitalist economic system. For authoritarian socialists, the state is instrumentalized. At present, the capitalist class wield the hammer, but as soon as the working class wield the hammer, then the state will no longer be an oppressive institution. This view stands in conflict with historical evidence and it ascribes autonomy of action to the state that it just doesn't have, by underestimating the extent to which capitalist economic relations are built into the functioning of the state apparatus. Most significantly, the hierarchical division of labour that inevitably comes with a centralised government. The inevitable result of a socialist revolution, whose aim is to conquer state power, is the monopolization of the means of production in the hands of the coordinator class, and hence the creation of state capitalism. The possibility of the coordinator class voluntarily just giving up the means of production to the working class during a socialist revolution seems extremely unlikely, because it runs contrary to the way the state as an institution functions, and the historical record is consistent with this view. So, is it the case that authoritarian socialist means of taking state power can be used successfully to achieve a state and class-free society based on worker control over the means of production? With all things considered, one must answer this question with an emphatic no. It seems to be the case that authoritarian socialist means cannot give rise to worker control over the means of production, but rather suppress it. Indeed, rather than achieving control by the workers, it achieves control of the workers. To quote John Holloway, "You cannot build a society of non-power relations by conquering power. Once the logic of power is adopted, the struggle against power is already lost." The notion that a stateless society based on workers' control over the means of production can be achieved through centralization of state power and the destruction of worker control over the means of production is on a level with the notion that humanity may achieve a society free from superstition by having everyone unquestioningly submit to the doctrines of the Church. So, if it is the case that taking state power cannot be used as a means to achieve a stateless society based on worker control, then consequently, the notion that doing so is necessary in virtue of its service to this end simply falls away, and little further discussion is necessary. However, for the sake of argument, despite all of the empirical evidence to the contrary, I'd like to entertain the notion that somehow the coordinator class would in fact hand over the means of production to the working class in a revolution organised upon authoritarian socialist means, and that it is in fact the case that authoritarian socialist means can in fact achieve a state and class-free society. I will offer this concession for the sake of addressing their other claims. Number 2. The necessity of state power. Is it necessary to take state power in order to achieve a state and class-free society? Authoritarian socialists argue that yes, this is the case, and for a number of reasons, which I'll address just now. The first is that the state is necessary in order to defend a revolution from internal and external capitalist threats. While it is clearly the case that defence of a revolution is necessary, it is not necessarily the case that such defence must necessarily take the form of a state in the sense mentioned earlier. That is to say, it does not necessarily have to be organised in a centralised and monopolistic fashion, nor does it require the creation of an administrative governing body. Furthermore, historical examples can be given which demonstrate that the functions which defending a revolution requires can be undertaken without the need for a state. For example, from 1918 to 1921, the Ukrainian anarcho-communist Free Territory, with a population of roughly 7 million, was defended by the Revolutionary Insurrectionary Army of Ukraine, or the Black Army, which had a democratic structure. Mass assemblies were held to discuss policy, officers in the traditional sense were abolished, and all commanders had to be elected and instantly revocable. The Black Army defended the region from the anti-communist White Army and sustained itself fairly well with the initial support of the Red Army. However, the Bolshevik forces later went on to make several surprise attacks against the anarchist militias, until eventually a massive military occupation took place, suppressing the Makhnovists and instituting state control. I wonder why they did that. Maybe they were upset at the fact that they had created a state and class-free society. It is perhaps ironic for authoritarian socialists to justify their methods on the grounds of defending the revolution when there is a consistent historical record suggesting that they're the ones whom the revolution must be defended from. Another argument made by authoritarian socialists for the alleged necessity of taking state power to achieve revolutionary ends is the idea that doing so is necessary for the building of class consciousness. That is to say, in order for the working class to become organised in active pursuit of its own interests rather than merely being a class of people with a common role to play in the capitalist mode of production, it is necessary to take state power. Again, this fails to account for historical evidence which suggests that it is in fact possible for members of the working class to organise in active pursuit of their own interests without the need for taking state power. We can look towards the Ukrainian Revolution creating an anarchist society, the Spanish Revolution creating an anarchist society, the recuperation of factories in Argentina, establishing areas of worker control over production, the autonomous Zapatista communities in Mexico, and the May 1968 events in France, in which decentralized wildcat strikes without the authorization of trade union officials, general strikes involving around 100 million workers, virtually brought the entire advanced capitalist economy of France to its knees. Further Furthermore, the strategies proposed by authoritarian socialists do not achieve a form of consciousness in which the working class self-organises in active pursuit of its own interests, but rather a form of consciousness in which the working class is subordinated to the interests of the party. By contrast, there are forms of organisation which can build up class consciousness without the need for taking state power, such as platformism, which creates organisations uniting their membership along a certain set of shared principles and ends, and also anarcho-syndicalism, creating revolutionary unions which seek to expropriate capital and general strikes, etc. So again, this is not necessary. Another argument given by authoritarian socialists is the idea that these methods are necessary for the needs of industrialization. However, historical evidence does not support this view. During the Spanish Revolution from 1936 to 1939, economic efficiency and production increased, despite the fact that prior to the revolution Spain was highly unindustrialized. Production, that is to say worker-controlled production during the revolution, was not small-scale either, but involved, according to Frank Mint's calculations based on CNT statistics, 1,838,000 collectivists in agriculture, industry and public services. Thus, we can reject arguments from industrialization. The arguments made by authoritarian socialists for the alleged necessity of taking state power are weak. Authoritarian socialists argue that doing so is necessary in order to carry out certain functions. However, historical evidence demonstrates that these functions can effectively be carried out without the need for authoritarian socialist means, and so doing so is unnecessary. Most significantly, the central aim of revolutionary socialism, that is to say, worker control over production, can indeed be achieved without the need for taking state power, and as such, authoritarian socialist means are totally unnecessary. Conclusion. I will summarise my argument as follows. The aim of revolutionary socialism is to establish a state and class-free society in which the workers own and control the means of production. There are two factions of revolutionary socialism, libertarian socialism and authoritarian socialism. These factions are divided over whether or not taking state power should be used as a means to achieving revolutionary socialist ends. Libertarian socialists oppose taking state power, whereas authoritarian socialists support taking state power. A form of hierarchy can be identified in authoritarian socialist means. This is because the centralised administrative governing component of the state apparatus, which authoritarian socialists seek to take control of, gives rise to a hierarchical division of labour in which the working class are subordinated to the coordinator class, who monopolise empowering labour. This form of hierarchy should be questioned. Unless this form of hierarchy can successfully meet its burden of proof, then it should be dismantled. Historical evidence demonstrates that when authoritarian socialist means are adopted, the coordinator class establishes monopolistic control over the means of production, leading to state capitalism, a state of affairs in which the previous functions of the capitalist class are undertaken by the state. States set up by authoritarian socialists have a consistent historical record of systematically undermining worker control. None of them have given rise to a state and class-free society, and the vast majority of them have recapitulated to corporate capitalism. As such, we can infer beyond a reasonable doubt that authoritarian socialist means do not give rise to revolutionary socialist ends. Historical evidence suggests that libertarian socialist means can achieve revolutionary socialist ends to a much greater extent than authoritarian socialist means. For example, during the Spanish Revolution, in which the workers abolished capitalism in the state as opposed to combining them, and established worker control as opposed to destroying it. Even if we are charitable to the authoritarian socialist position and we suppose that authoritarian socialist means can in fact achieve revolutionary socialist ends, authoritarian socialist means still lack any intrinsic justification. The arguments made by authoritarian socialists for the necessity of a state-driven pathway are predicated on carrying out certain functions which are necessary to achieve revolutionary socialist ends, such as building class consciousness, defending the revolution, and industrialization. However, all of these functions can be undertaken without the need for authoritarian socialist means, and as such they are not necessary. However, given that authoritarian socialist means cannot achieve revolutionary socialist ends, whereas libertarian socialist means can, we can conclude beyond a reasonable doubt that if one is to seek the achievement of revolutionary socialist ends, one must advocate libertarian socialist means. For the authoritarian socialist, two pathways are available. On the one hand, to retain their belief in revolutionary socialist ends, they must consequently change their position on the state, not as an institution which can serve the interests of anybody, but as an institution whose intrinsic purpose is to serve the interests of an elite minority at the expense of the population. And consequently, they must renounce their belief in authoritarian socialist means. On the other hand, authoritarian socialists can instead advocate the state capitalism of the party bureaucracy as an end in itself, joining the ranks of those who support the continuing subordination of the masses to a political and economic elite, and consequently abandoning any pretense of supporting revolutionary socialist ends. You can believe in the social revolution, which seeks to abolish class society and the state, or you can believe in authority. You cannot, however, believe in both. Time is running out, and authoritarian political and economic institutions are beginning to take their toll on the species and the environment, threatening the prospects for decent survival. And I can assure you that an irrational belief in the authoritarian principles upon which these institutions are organised will not do anything for you or your fellow human beings, but instead act as a direct barrier to your own emancipation. The evidence is overwhelming, and to directly deny it is to go directly against your own interests.